Hey everybody, welcome to the second part of our Wildchat series on defending Oregon's waters. My name's Dylan. I'm the grassroots organizer with Cascadia Wildlands, and the Wildchats have been an ongoing webinar program that we've been putting on since the beginning of quarantine to keep folks engaged with this work and just kind of do a deep dive on a different topic, every week, and then kind of been pushing it back to bi-weekly as, the summer season's gotten going and we've been really out in the field a lot more. So like I said, this is the second part of a two-part webinar series on forest waters. And so late last month, a few weeks ago, we had a really great webinar about the MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, between environmental groups and the timber industry on proposed changes to the Oregon Forest Practices Law and how kind of that, like the trajectory that's moving on. And then so today I wanted to give like a kind of look at an alternative strategy that some other groups are taking to further preserve our forest waters, with a specific look into municipal drinking watersheds, because as I'm sure you all know, our forests are integral to maintaining clean water supplies for our communities, especially our rural communities and those living in some of the most impacted areas by logging. And as well, thinking about moving forward into the uncertain times that climate change will bring, when our freshwater access and our snowpack will be gravely impacted by warmer temperatures. And so that's a big part of the reason why we've been focusing so much on water recently, with these webinars and with a number of other campaigns and other work that we're doing organizationally. And so I wanted to just give the Center for Sustainable Economy and my dear friend Sam Krop an opportunity to talk about this angle that they have taken to advocate for freshwater resources. And so yeah, with that, I just introduce Sam Krop, who's the Wild and Working Forests Coordinator with Center for Sustainable Economy. And we also have Betsy Herbert, who is a PhD in environmental studies with a focus on forest management. And they've really teamed up, and we've been working with them in a supportive role to be advocating for these drinking watersheds and protecting them from the ravages of industrial logging. So without further ado, I'll just pass it off to my friend Sam.
Thanks.
And Sam, do you want to give a quick intro, a broad overview kind of, and then we can do a deeper dive?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have so many folks joining to talk about this important issue of how logging impacts our drinking water supplies. So I do have some slides to share. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That should work.
Yeah.
Great. And I'm gonna play. So I just wanted to start with this because this is something that for one, I've been working on forest issues for a long time. Primarily my work has been focused on public lands defense and monitoring logging practices happening on public lands, federal and state lands. But more and more, I have been turning a focus to private land management, which many of us who've been working on forest defense kind of call the elephant in the room when it comes to all of the work that we're doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that down the line, but this figure here is incredibly important to kind of frame the conversation that we're about to have, which is the fact that 2/3 of Oregonians get their drinking water from a forested watershed. So just that connection between drinking water and land management, forest management, is so critical to the majority of Oregonians. So this is an interesting map. And what we're looking at here, just to kind of hammer the importance of these drinking water supplies home, is these are surface water source areas. So these are different than drinking watersheds, or these are different than watersheds, but because these represent actually where different communities are pulling their water from surface water areas. So for instance, we know that the Mackenzie River is where Eugene gets its drinking water from. And so there's a shape here around Eugene that reflects the actual geographic limits of that surface water area and all of the land inside of it. So there are, as you can see, a lot, over 160 of these surface drinking watersheds in Oregon, mostly on the western side of the Cascades, and they all intertwine and each represent, again, a different actual body of water that we're relying on for our community's survival. And so this is just another way to see that. I couldn't get this map to not pixelate, so it's not the best, but they do have names. And just another example, this is directly from the Department of Environmental Quality's website. Just an interesting map that we don't normally see when we're talking about land management. So this is an ugly picture of a clear cut, and just to kind of frame the issue, because while we have these like incredibly important surface drinking watersheds, unfortunately, egregious logging practices are happening and continue to happen in these drinking watersheds. And so in many of the forests that are responsible for filtering the water that we drink, these sorts of clear cutting practices are happening. And they're happening not just on private land, as one might expect, but they're also happening in surface drinking watershed areas in federal land and in state land. And they're happening all of the time. And so for me, in my history of working on forest defense, the focus on drinking water is incredibly important because, in my opinion, it's the thing that links forests the most to humans and to our communities. We know that forests here in the Pacific Northwest are absolutely vital for a number of reasons, including carbon storage, for habitat creation, but filtering our drinking water is something that is really undervalued and under talked about, and is an incredibly important ecosystem service that our forests provide. And we know that this is an undervalued service because these sorts of clear cutting practices are happening all of the time. And so what we tried to do, and what you're looking at here is the ferns. It's a snapshot of the ferns database, which for those of you who are not familiar with ferns, it is a state Oregon Department of Forestry run database that has all of the different planned logging proposals on private, state, and federal lands. And you can look them up using the search feature. You can find exactly who owns them. You can find out if they are in a drinking water source area or another significant area. And you can find the acreage and the location. So we're looking at, actually, I took a snapshot of a really nasty Bureau of Land Management clear-cut proposal demonstrated on ferns. But what we did is we used the ferns database with the help of Madeline Cowan, who's on here and is our GIS extraordinaire, and her Greenfire GIS organization, to pull together these numbers about all of the clear cuts currently being proposed in drinking water supplies that communities rely on around the state. And what we found as of July of this year is that there were over 50,000 acres of clear cuts planned in our drinking water sources. And that's just as of July. So we can expect that there are more right now. And so the purpose, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna jump in here, Sam. You're the co-host, so can you make sure that there aren't any folks in the waiting room right now?
Yes, sorry, I can't share the screen and do that at the same time.
No, so. I'm sorry. I should have made you a co-host instead of the full host.
That's all right. I just admitted them all.
Perfect. And if you want to just make me the full host right now, or make me a co-host or whatever.
Sure.
that'd be great, and I can take over from that. Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks. It seems like it's inevitable. There's always one thing that'll go wrong. But anyways, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sam. You're telling us all about these just these clear cuts throughout our drinking water supplies, and I'm curious, why are clear cuts bad? They don't look very nice, but I don't know why. What are they doing to our water?
Sure. Thank you for asking that. Some of us who are really in the weeds on this issue just assume that everyone already knows why clear cuts are problematic. So I'm happy to answer that. So we wanted to do this project because we wanted to shed light on this issue, which is a major issue. And I'm going to go back to this one later because I want to directly answer this. What is the problem with clear cutting on drinking water sources? This is a particularly nasty picture of a private land clear cut that's directly over a small annual stream. But for many reasons, clear cutting is particularly destructive to waterways. Starting with the issue of water quality, we know that clear cutting contributes to landslides and erosion. And so obviously the root systems of trees are incredibly important in holding intact the forest floor and preventing the sort of situation that you see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, massive landslide, and all of that leading into a riparian area, a waterway at the base of that. So contributing to the sedimentation of waterways, which we know is a serious challenge for fish and aquatic species. Also, there's a major issue with clear cutting and the contribution of herbicide spray. So one of the practices that is commonplace and normal after private lands and state land clear cuts is the aerial application of pesticides and herbicides using helicopters, which we know often wafts into neighboring waterways, despite the fact that there are minimal buffers that require these helicopters to minimally avoid these waterways. All of these toxins are still going and getting into our drinking water supplies, which contributes to the problem of harmful algae blooms. So when you have these herbicides getting into a waterway, another thing that I didn't mention is raising stream temperatures. We know that clear-cut logging contributes to higher water temperatures on the land base, so that conglomeration of issues creates harmful algae blooms, which also are a major challenge to salmonid populations that we rely on for food and that the forest relies on for food and for ecosystem stability. So major issues with water quality from clear-cut management. Also, and this is just a fun list of all of the Oregon public water systems that are currently at risk of toxic algae blooms. And this is because of a variety of reasons, including agriculture, industrial agriculture, but also including clear-cut logging. And something that's interesting about this is, and maybe Betsy will bring this up, is that many of the water managers don't actually do point source, they don't monitor for point source pollution. So it's not always clear that these issues are happening and coming from specific logging projects. But we do know that there's some major issues with toxic algae blooms in many of these areas that are also happen to be the heaviest logged forested watersheds according to the FERN's data. So we can kind of put two and two together there. But this is the biggest piece in terms of why should we care to me. Very recent, very important scientific studies have been done across watershed analysis, mostly focused in the Coast Range of Oregon, and coming out over the course of the past few years, as soon as, or as recent as last year in 2019, we have some great science that shows clearly that clear-cut plantation style forestry reduces the available water on a landscape by 50% compared to older native forests. So just another, these amazing graphics were just released by the Forest Waters Coalition, who spoke 2 weeks ago. Just really useful educational tools. Just another way to tell the story, but major issues for water quantity. And as we know, less water and higher stream temperatures equals less salmon, and for us, less drinking water. And so the reason, to circle back, Dylan, and to kind of conclude this, is that the reason why we're doing this project is because these ongoing practices that are happening right now significantly stress and threaten our community's ability to have access to drinking water, which is a fundamental right, and one that we know is becoming more and more threatened with the advent of climate change. So yeah, that's the why.
Wow, I thought I didn't like clear cuts before you gave me that answer, but geez. So I'm curious, you drive down the I-5 or you're driving along a forest road and you're seeing all these clear cuts. Now when you see those clear cuts, you're understanding that the very water that you're drinking is being endangered for these corporate profits. But I'm curious, who is it that are the worst offenders? Who are the people that are responsible for these, just this blight on our mountains, and on our landscape?
Thank you so much for asking that question. I have a slide that I wanted to show you all that just is a snapshot. So in the project that I'm talking about, we quantified, or we added up all of the clear cuts and who's responsible per drinking water supply in the hardest hit locations in Oregon. And so many of the tables at the end of each drinking water supply letter looked like this one: Weyerhaeuser, 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 Weyerhaeuser. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of clear cuts. And so I wanted to just, begin the answer to that question by saying private land management is a major issue. And what I mean by that is industrial, large scale private land management. There's a number of phenomenal models for small scale private land management done intelligently that we would love to point to. But this is the big picture of who is doing the damage on our drinking water supply, is large scale, industrial, private land clear cut managers. And I wanted to demonize Weyerhaeuser because they just own the most land, but worthy of naming also are Lone Rock Timber Company, Seneca Jones Timber Company. These organizations are the biggest polluters of our drinking water supplies. And I also wanted to name, just briefly, that in addition to the private land clear cuts, we see a lot of this. This is a Bureau of Land Management variable retention harvest, which is a euphemism for clear cuts with small patches of remaining trees. These are happening on our federal lands in our drinking water supplies all of the time. And so while we should keep the focus on private land managers because they're absolutely doing the most egregious damage, there is a lot of damage being done on federal land under the Bureau of Land Management, under these euphemisms. And there's a lot of damage being done under the Oregon State University banner. And this is something that I want to circle back to at the very end. And I know that we have Doug Pollock on here, who has been leading up a charge to shine a light on these practices, who can add a little bit more. But for my answer to that, I'll leave it at that this damage is being done on private land, it's being done on federal land, and it's being done by Oregon State University forest managers, who, I should add, Oregon State University also happened to put out the cutting edge science showing clearly that this kind of management is destructive for water quantity. And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but alas, that's what's happening.
And so, I think the reason why we wanted to highlight the work that you've been doing, Sam, on this issue, and with all the other organizations and individuals that you've been working with, is because you're kind of approaching tackling this issue from a different angle than I think a lot of the other organizations and more like traditional environmental groups are doing. And so I'm curious, how do you think that we need to address this, massive issue of private forest management and federal forest management and our state university forest management endangering our communities by impacting our water supplies?
Thanks for that question. I want to answer a little bit right now, but also circle back after Betsy talks more and maybe Doug talks more, and we could hammer on some more next steps, because there are some good campaigns running right now. But in terms of what you can do and what our water managers can do specifically, we've been getting involved in reaching out to water managers who are responsible for ensuring the water quality and quantity for communities. And we've been essentially presenting them with a menu of options, beginning with simply actually monitoring this stuff. Like I said earlier, many of them are not monitoring the point source pollution. And so there's no public awareness of the fact that this is happening or the implications of these practices for drinking water. But also there's a lot of really exciting possibilities in terms of reimagining how this land is managed. Obviously, for private land managers who are big industrial managers, they're not going to just be asked nicely to change their ways and agree. We have to think about ways to incentivize that change. And maybe that looks like coming up with government funds to incentivize climate smart, water smart forestry over industrial practices. Maybe it looks like raising funds to buy out the most critical public water source forests and keep them for public ownership, for the perpetuity of our drinking water, and just take them out of the cycle of short rotation timber harvest. But there's some budget possibilities that are really exciting. There's also some exciting possibilities to address this issue on the state level under the governor's new executive order on climate change, where she requires all state agencies to address the issue of carbon storage and long-term climate adaptability on the land. And so in addition to kind of local watershed managers stepping up and being creative with their budgets and thinking about how they can do that on a local level, we have some major state power and possibility behind the idea of actually changing the policies around how critical forests are managed, and managing rather than managing specifically and only for timber revenue, which is what's happening. We can insert a value system and insert a management imperative that considers water quality on the landscape. So those are just a couple simple things, but I think we can circle back once we've heard more from Betsy, and maybe Doug also can provide some more info about OSU next steps.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. And I just want to make a note too, I put it in the chat, but if you all have any questions during this presentation, please feel free to just drop them into the chat, which you should be able to access by pressing the button at the bottom of your screen. And then we can come back and I'll moderate a Q&A towards the end. So if you have any questions for Sam, for Betsy, or for Doug, please feel free to just drop those in. I see we've got a couple, so we'll make some time at the end. So then I just want to pass it to you, Betsy, and you can just maybe give us a little bit more of the scientific grounding and talk to us a little bit about your studies and your expertise.
Sure, happy to. Thank you for having me. When I started my PhD dissertation, I was very interested because of my activity in Santa Cruz, California, of trying to protect our local water supplies from industrial logging. Even though it's not clear cut down there, it's still very intense commercial logging with a very dense road networks that are extremely damaging to water supplies. So I was curious. I knew from my research, just a little bit of literature review, that nationwide, it's very widely acknowledged that public water utilities own only a small percentage, usually, of their drinking watersheds, from the watersheds from which they draw water. So they usually, generally speaking, own a small percentage of that watershed. So they're basically charged with protecting a water supply over which they have little control. Nobody likes to be in a situation like that. So there's been a lot of push from water utilities over the years to acquire land in their watersheds one way or another, either by outright purchase or with the help of land trusts and conservation easements on the property. So what I was interested to find out is, of all of the public water utilities on the West Coast of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, that own forest land in their watersheds, I was very interested to find out how are they managing their forest land? Because if they're doing a tremendous job, then we could point to them as models and, you know, to the rest of the people who are logging and say, well, this is how you have to manage your land for water quality and supply. So I set out and I identified all 45 public water utilities in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington on the West Coast that owned forest land from which they drew public water. And I analyzed all of their forest management practices by reviewing databases like Ferns and other similar ones in other states. And what I found is that there's a tremendous variation from, you know, these public water utilities, anywhere from completely protected watersheds, zero logging, all the way up to intensive industrial clear cuts. So it was just a very interesting question, is what accounts for this variation in logging practices by public water utilities? One might expect, since they fought to protect their watersheds, that it seems illogical that they would, some of them anyway, go out and just clear cut. So I did find, after a lot of different statistical analysis and doing some case studies, I found 3 community factors amongst all of these water utilities that combined were perfect predictors of whether or not a water utility would engage in commercial logging. And they were, first of all, I'll start with the factors that are perfect predictors of water utilities that are going to do commercial logging on their land. First of all, they do not allow public access to their watersheds. And it's usually ostensibly because they think they're protecting the watershed from damage. And so there's no public access allowed. That's the first predictor. The second predictor is commercial timberland owners that are neighboring landowners in the watershed. If they're surrounded by commercial timberland owners, you would think that they would be so horrified by what they're seeing that they wouldn't do any logging, but in fact, it's just the opposite. And then the third factor is, if a water utility is is directed by a city council, such as Corvallis, just for an example, Corvallis City Council, they control the city's watershed. And then the other type of government that controls a public water supply would be a special district. And so in this case, it's the city councils that are the ones that are much more apt to log. And we could go into why this, you know, my explanations and my case studies, what it revealed is why these are true. But I found that if you combined all 3 of these, where there's no public access allowed, where there's commercial timberland owners, neighboring owners in the watershed, and where it's a city council, that every single one of the water utilities in my study engaged in commercial logging. And conversely, if the water utility allowed the public in to the watershed, and if there was no commercial timberland owned in the watershed, and that was a special district, those conducted absolutely no commercial logging. And so different combinations, you would have a full spectrum, but those are the 2 extremes. So I think the most important one probably is public access to the watershed. And that's because if people are allowed to go there and they're allowed to hike there and they're allowed to connect with the watershed in a, you know, kind of a recreational way or a spiritual way, they just have a sense of place, then they're much more apt to be involved in making sure that the watershed is managed correctly and not, you know, clear cut, for example. Commercial timberland neighbors, I've seen an example of this in my own experience in Santa Cruz County in California, where the city of Watsonville owned a beautiful piece of old forest, and it was the heart of their watershed. And for years they had commented about upstream water timberland owners logging and how much it was affecting the water supply and how they were against it. And then it became apparent to the city council of Watsonville that if they logged their watershed, they would be able to make a lot of money. And so just kind of like overnight, when they had the, you know, light bulb went off that they could make a lot of money, they filed a commercial timber harvest plan. So the commercial timberland owners will sometimes approach the other neighbors so that they can do a joint logging operation. You know, it could be more efficient that way. And, you know, they also can show the water utility how much money can be made. So that's kind of why that is an important factor. And now, why are city councils more apt to conduct commercial logging than special districts? And I think what I found in my interviews, I interviewed more than 40 different folks in these watersheds, in these water utilities. And city councils are charged with so much more than just regulating their, or, you know, managing their watersheds for drinking water. They have all kinds of different demands. They have a general fund that has to service all different kinds of services. So when they have a shortfall, they're always looking for an income stream from somewhere. And it's oftentimes when it becomes obvious to them that they could make a great deal of money in a short period of time by just logging the hell out of their land, they can't seem to help themselves. But you will never see any one of these water utility managers, you will never see them admit that any of their logging practices are harmful. You know, they always have the best intentions. They always say that their logging plans, are sustainable. And, you know, they sound just like private timberland owners. So I just found that this was very kind of elucidating for me. And I was not surprised by, you know, Sam and I had an interview with one of the city public works directors, and they're conducting, and this is Corvallis, they don't allow public recreation in their watershed. They have commercial timberland neighbors, and they're directed by city council. So you know they're going to log, and they do, but they defend it as being sustainable. And you know, they say that it's just they're a small fish in a big pond, and we really should be going and looking at other, instead of forestry, we should really be looking more at things like agriculture. And so they'll always try to shift the blame to someone else. So, you know, this is not, this is science, because I did all of this research using, you know, statistical analysis and all kinds of case studies. And my research was written up and peer reviewed and was published in the Journal of the American Water Works Association. So, you know, it's past the muster here. I could elucidate more of what Sam was saying about, what are the impacts of industrial logging. And, just one thing I'd like to add is to what she has said, is the logging roads are a tremendous factor, both in terms of destabilizing the landscape and contributing to erosion and landslides, and as a result, sedimentation and all of those other water quality issues. But logging roads also are, they compact the watershed. The roads are, the logs and the logging trucks and the equipment is so heavy that it really compacts the soils. And so then the water doesn't soak in. When the rain comes, instead of soaking in where it can be held onto during the winter time, instead it runs off into the streams, and it can cause flooding. So you get high stream flows in the winter when you don't need it and you don't want it, and then in the summer the water's not soaked in, so you get less water in the summer. And for decades and decades, we've known that logging roads are a huge contributor to this problem. And then the Safe Drinking Water Act requires public water utilities to monitor water quality, but it's only when it comes into the treatment plant. And when you think about a watershed, most times a watershed is not just one stream that flows directly into a water treatment plant. It's a whole system of, one large stream and smaller and smaller and smaller class 3 streams at the top, just like, a circulation system would be. And so if you have timber activities or other harmful land uses throughout the watershed, you're never going to know what the contributing factors are if you just monitor the source when it comes into the plant, because it's all combined into one there. So you've really got to go out and into the watershed and start monitoring so you can trace the sources of this stuff that's coming down into the water. And it can be done, but in my study, I found none of the water utilities that I looked at were doing source water quality monitoring in the watershed. And it's critical to being able to pinpoint where the trouble's coming from. So that's my story.
Great. So I know that you've studied the social cost of water purification. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, or give us a little overview of that aspect of this work?
Oh yeah, well, like Sam was talking about, is that forests are provide a tremendous ecosystem service to us in terms of water filtration. And it's been shown many times scientifically that older undisturbed forests provide the clearest, purest water. And we have an example in Oregon of one that we can use, which is the Bull Run in Portland, where it's been protected. I mean, there is a huge struggle to do that, but it's been protected. And so they really don't have to spend much on water filtration. It saves them a huge amount of money because they're taking advantage of the free ecosystem services provided by an relatively undisturbed forest. So, and I personally was involved in getting the city of Santa Cruz to stop logging its extensive watershed. We did an economic study of that watershed, and we found that after we added up all the timber revenues that they got from logging their watershed land, it still was not going to come close to the cost of abandoning those logging roads that they put into the watershed. They found that those logging roads were a huge contributor to water pollution And they were also filling up the reservoir. You know, the sediment comes down and fills the reservoir up. So those are huge costs that you have to deal with. And so all the logging revenues that they got out of that forest in the short term were not enough to make up for how much it was going to cost them to put it all back to almost the way it was before, but not quite as good.
Great, thank you. And so I want to go back to Sam here and just ask, is there, you know, an example of this kind of reckless management and the direct fruits that it bears right here in Oregon?
There sure is. There's a lot of these examples actually, but the one I want to highlight is an interesting one, and then I'm going to punt to my friend Doug Pollock here, who's going to hopefully be able to talk a little more about the background. But I'm going to share my screen again just real quick because, oh, host disabled screen sharing. I've got a great map. But just for context, while we're getting the screen sharing up, there, as we did this project, and something that Betsy pointed out a moment ago so eloquently is that these watersheds or these drinking water source areas aren't super obvious. They're not linear. They're not following necessarily, you know, like one water body. So this is a picture of Wilsonville, Oregon.
Sam, your volume just kind of went away.
Oh, hello?
Oh, that's better now.
Okay. The blue blob is Wilsonville's drinking water source area. And as you can see, it mostly follows the Willamette River, but you've got all of the tributaries kind of pouring into there. So it includes other water bodies that affect the drinking water supply. Wilsonville pulls their water directly from the Willamette. And the drinking water source area begins, the southernmost end you can see, is beginning kind of around Corvallis. So part of Corvallis's drinking water also comes from the Willamette, but it's a different drinking water source area because where they pull from the Willamette is south of here. In other words, upstream. The Willamette runs south to north like a weird river that it is. So Wilsonville is downstream from Corvallis. So the reason why I'm showing this is a couple things. This is an interesting watershed. It's a really large drinking water source area. Also, it's the most heavily hit drinking water source area with clear cuts right now. To put it in perspective, there's over 4,000 acres of clear cuts currently proposed and happening in this drinking water source area, whereas the next runners up were Cottage Grove and some places in Lynn County who were in the 2000s. So major clear cutting happening. And I think this is a particularly interesting example because if you look, so the red areas are the planned cuts and the pink is past clear cuts. So if you look, you can see a lot of the red planned cuts kind of just northwest of Corvallis. And that is within the McDonald Research Forest, OSU's McDonald Dunn Research Forests. So OSU is directly responsible for polluting Wilsonville's drinking water supply, and they're still doing it. And so with that, and also giving, I don't know if you can all see the credit here, but this is, again, Madeline, amazing GIS skills, put this together for us. But just with that, I want to just punt it to Doug, who is the director of Friends of OSU Old Growth and is a whistleblower in terms of OSU egregious logging, and can maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I hope my sound's coming through okay here. So one of the things I wanted to clarify to people is why we're focusing as one of our parts of this campaign on OSU. You know, it's very different. I see it as very different from the National Forest Bureau Land Management, and that OSU is really the, you know, our leading educational institute for forestry in the nation, and one of the best supposedly in the world. And so what they do, what they teach really has a profound influence on all of these companies. If you look at Weyerhaeuser or any of these, Starker Forest or any of these companies, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, they have a really high population of OSU College of Forestry graduates. So, you know, OSU has educated generations of foresters, and they're doing it as a public institution. They're playing a leading role in forming and shaping how forestry is done in the Northwest. So what we look at here is there's really this interesting dichotomy. You have some researchers at OSU that are just doing amazing work. You know, they're doing world leading edge work in carbon storage and sequestration, in like the study that Catalina Segura and those others worked on that showed the 50% reduction in water flows. But then on the other hand, you have the research forests. We have about 11,300 acres just northwest of Corvallis here, that they're essentially managing like the timber companies managed back in the 70s and 80s. You know, they cut the old growth last summer. The majority of the cuts they've done in the last decade have been clear cuts. There's really no research basis for most of what they're doing. That's one of the things people don't really understand, is they say it's a research forest, and yet most of what they're doing is just funding their own bureaucracy, the managers that oversee this forest management, these guys that I refer to as kind of the hardliners. And so, you know, we're trying to focus on OSU in part because they, you know, they have this enormous ability to influence the industry, but also because their practices are so egregious in their own research forests. And the tie into Wilsonville, I think, is really important because it shows that, you know, clear cuts have this enormous impact far beyond the boundaries of the land unit. And so one of the issues I want to tie into this too is, if you've, I hope all of you saw the OPB ProPublica article that came out just last week, the second in the series, but it was focusing largely on the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, which is this publicly funded institute created by the legislature in 1991. All of their funding comes from tax revenue from the forest products harvest tax. So it is entirely publicly funded. And they just came out with this 300-page study done with OSU faculty, professors. And you know, it's a coincidence it just came out, but it's all focused on essentially municipal watersheds and the impacts of logging on drinking water. And this caught my attention a few weeks ago, but it's really interesting. If you go to the OFFRE webpage and the College of Forestry Facebook page, there's a link to it. It's just a complete marketing propaganda tool for the timber industry. It just presents, you know, it has these beautiful pictures of pristine rivers. It talks about how, you know, the primary impacts on drinking water come from agriculture and urban areas. It downplays anything coming from forestry. And yet, if you go into the 300-page report and look at the actual research that the OSU people did, it's a very different picture. They barely mention the research from this last year by Segura that showed the 50% reduction. It's just a cherry picking of data out of this OSU study that involved a number of prominent researchers. And so for us, that's especially troubling, because here you have a public institution that ought to be operating in the best interest of our, you know, all Oregonians, and they're essentially colluding with this propaganda instrument for the timber industry, which is funded by public tax dollars. And, you know, I don't think the professors that were involved in this had any bad intent. I think, you know, it's partly a challenge for the university system that they look to get funding wherever they can get it, and they don't have any say really in how their research is used. So in this case, OFFRE presented a very unbalanced view, and it really is a disservice to Oregon State University, to the integrity of our academic institution. This is one of the reasons why we're trying to get into this with the new dean. You know, they just hired Tom DeLuca as a new dean of the College of Forestry, who started July 1st. And this is one of the issues we want to bring up with him, is when you have, you know, the right hand of OSU doing this amazing groundbreaking research, the left hand doing this study, which is feeding the propaganda arm of the timber industry, it's really doing a grave disservice to the university. It's you know, it's missing the opportunity that they could have done in helping to shape more sustainable forestry and management of the watershed. So it's a real conundrum. We're hoping the new dean can change that, but it's basically, for those of us who followed OSU, this is, it's been decades and decades of this kind of behavior with, the industry trying to influence the college, funding it, their primary source of funding. And so we see OSU really as a catalyst for change in this, that we can hopefully convince the new dean to take a more active role in how OSU research is shaping the dialogue, and that it's not being used as a propaganda instrument. So, is there anything else you wanted me to cover while we're talking? I could go on and on, but I don't want to take over.
No, that's great. Sam, do you want to make any final comments before we open it up for questions, and maybe just end on a note as far as how everyone on this call here tonight can, take this information and put it into some actual praxis, put it into use, and advocate for some meaningful change along these lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Doug, for that really important context. I'm glad that you're able to jump on. OSU is obviously a part of this puzzle, and I think for the reasons Doug just said, for their role in the science and academics, I think we need to be pinning them on this. Also for their proximity to many of you all I know who live in and around that area. But there are a lot of things that can be done by us, and one of the issues is that this feels like such a large, kind of amorphous and unwieldy issue, and it's taking place, as we've said, on private, public, and public lands, and so there's a lot of responsible bodies and a lot of issues at play. But a couple things that are in the works right now that people who are interested in jumping on board with can, aside from the MOU process, which I know has been talked about in a couple weeks ago's piece, so I'm not going to go into that. But there is a major effort to connect land management with community health. And that's incredibly, incredibly important. And so some of the images that I showed earlier are, I'm going to send those out to you all in the follow-up email for this, but they're public for all of us to use who are doing this work. And so continuing to educate folks on the connections between clear-cut logging and water quantity degradation or depletion and water degradation is super important, not just for each other, but for our policymakers, because this issue is going to start turning up in policy on the state level and probably on the federal level too. As climate change becomes more of a concern and focus, we know that people are going to be thinking about the long-term stability and adaptability of our forest ecosystems, and that includes water availability. And so the more we can make that connection clear, the better. Also, Doug and others are involved in a really exciting effort to engage with the new Dean of Oregon State University to encourage a shift and a real adoption of climate smart, water smart forest management and a moratorium on clear-cut logging practices that are happening right now. And so that's an incredibly important piece. We are continuing to keep the pressure on water managers across the state. And so one thing every single person here can do is look up their water manager. And I'll follow up to this with a sample letter that we've been sending, and send them a letter that says, we want you to take action, with the menu of options that I included earlier, which I'll include in the follow-up email. Contacting water managers and keeping the pressure on. And then the last thing I'll say is, we, in response to the OPB piece, we, and always, because getting earned media is very important, we've been contributing to an ongoing discourse in the news that looks like publishing letters to the editor, publishing opinion pieces that are keeping the conversation going, and we really are actually doing quite a good job of it as of late. So if you have the ability to contribute to the conversation, please do. And I'd be happy if folks want to get more plugged in to kind of like the policy pieces and the nitty gritty to fill folks in on that. And you can feel free to give me a shout at Sam, or it's actually, I can put it here in the chat so everyone has it. But it's just skrop@sustainableeconomy.org.
Great. Yeah, and we'll do a follow-up email as well to everyone who's registered for the event. So if you want to be on that follow-up email and you haven't actually formally registered, make sure you register so I have your email on the list. And then I'll send out an email with Doug and Sam and Betsy copied, and with some other resources that they've put together, so folks can do a deeper dive if you're interested. And I also want to flag that I've pasted in a primer for writing letters to the editor and op-eds. That's a really great resource to writing effective pieces that will get published in local and regional outlets. So really encourage everyone take an opportunity to do that. And if you're interested, you know, we're always doing work, whether it's looking at federal lands logging or private and state lands. And so if you want to get more involved with the work that we do, highly encourage everyone to reach out to me and get plugged in with the Wildcats. It's a great way to start really learning about, you know, all of this kind of obscure or opaque policy, and get out in the field and put your hands on some of this you know, work. So yeah, please, thanks everyone for jumping on. And we had a few questions really briefly I wanted to circle back to, and a lively debate. I'm going to leave the debate here for a minute, but Alan had a great comment. I've been affiliated with several different entities and have experienced working with various agencies that are supposed to monitor and protect the water quality of the state. In my experience, the state is guilty of turning a blind eye to any problems, especially when the culpable parties are municipalities, timber, or agriculture. I have many examples to back up my position. Thanks for that comment, Alan. I think that that's a sentiment that many of us hold. And Marcus asked about what kind of chemicals they'll spray on through aerial spraying helicopters on these timber sales. And Madeline had a really great answer that I just read out here just for the benefit of anyone who doesn't have access to the chat. So they use a number of different chemicals, most notably atrazine and glyphosate, 2,4-D with acid, atrazine, clopyralid, glyphosate, hexazine 1, imazapyr, sulfametron, methyl, and a bunch of other chemicals that I cannot pronounce, many of which I assume, and I know glyphosate, are carcinogenic, so giving you cancer. And then I had just one last question, I believe, at the top that I want to oh, Darlene asked about the Bull Run watershed, which I know was mentioned. I just asked, Portland has protected our watershed, right? The Bull Run watershed, I think. Is there anything either Sam or Betsy or Doug would add about that effort in protecting Bull Run, or if that could serve as a model for other efforts in other municipalities?
I could add something. When I was doing my research, I went to the Portland Library, and this was quite a long time ago, but they had like 3 filing cabinets full of these amazing documents that was the entire story of how the Bull Run watershed was saved. It's a beautiful example of how public participation and community involvement is absolutely critical. Nothing ever gets done without that grassroots from bottom up kind of push. So I think it's a beautiful story and example of how to do it right.
Great, thank you, Betsy. And so just one last thing I would acknowledge before we wrap up, we've got 1 more minute. Is Marcus was curious about fertilizers being sprayed, and Sam, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but Sam is certain that there are fertilizers that are sprayed, and talking a little bit about the impacts.
Yeah, well, there's a concoction sprayed of herbicides and fertilizers. And so obviously, like, there's a control being done around what's grown. And so certain things are dug for primarily monoculture populations are encouraged through the use of fertilizers, and herbicides are meant to kill everything else. And so there is a concoction, and I saw, Craig, you asked about a research paper that speaks to that. And one thing that I can include in the follow-up email is the actual letters that we published and sent to each of the water system managers in association with this campaign, which includes the tally of all of the logging happening, who's responsible, but also a lot great scientific studies supporting all the claims that we just made on the Zoom.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you everybody for jumping on, and a special thanks to Betsy and Doug for doing all the work that you both are doing. And I just want to reiterate, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with some additional information and contact info so that anyone who's interested can follow up. And please, yeah, feel free to reach out to myself or Sam if you want more information or help with writing LTEs or op-eds. And just consider talking to, you know, your city managers about your drinking watersheds and how you can start fighting against this just like egregious management and the endangerment of, you know, our communities through aerial spraying, through, you know, industrial logging and what have you. So really appreciate it. And we've got a great spicy comment from Alan in the chat too. So recommend y'all checking that out. And thanks everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.